So let's focus on a social phenomenon that is quite pertinent at the moment in light of some of the controversies that you see, particularly online and on social media, cancel culture. This refers to the phenomenon where individuals or groups are publicly shamed or boycotted, often on social media, for perceived offensive behavior or statements. In this country, this concept has gained traction, reflecting broader societal issues. In recent news, for example, a well-known amapiano artist was entangled in controversy as his fans expressed outrage and calling for him to be cancelled. We have also seen recently the popular podcaster being embroiled in a dispute and has faced some backlash for remarks made on his widely followed platform, and some calling for the podcast itself to be shut down. Reputation management advisor and independent media professional Solly Moeng joins me now to take that discussion forward. Solly, good afternoon. Thank you for your time. So let's start with a broad definition so that we all move and we're all on the same page. What is cancel culture?
Cancel culture, nice to meet and everybody out there. Look, it is the phenomenon of saying, and the attitude of thinking that one's views of the world are the only ones that are correct, that should be accepted, that should be given space to be aired, and everybody else who differs with them must be considered to be sick or not belonging, not deserving to be had. And as you say, it's been gaining traction in South Africa. And the problem with South Africa is that it also tends to be racial, right? Certain people cannot express themselves because of past, actions of people who look like them. But it also really does cut across.
So, from what you've just described, Solly, and I must allude that I read a very interesting piece on the TFG Club magazine, interestingly enough, the Foshini group, they have this club magazine, and I guess somewhere in that context, this came up. They talk about cancel culture referring to a mass withdrawal of support from brands, celebrities, or ordinary people who have done or said things that are deemed socially unacceptable or perceived to be offensive. Let me then pose this question to you, Solly. Is it always problematic when people mete out this form of consequence management, saying, let's all withdraw our support from this brand, from this individual?
Yeah, it is, of course. Usually it's a handful of people who tend to have a lot of influence and who are followed by other people. But I think when we live in a country or in a world that is very diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, we need to have tolerance. I think it's best to hear of dissenting views than to try and push them underground, because they will views always find their way out of the ground, of crevices where they are hidden, and sometimes they come out in very violent ways. I think it's important to always allow people to express themselves. We don't have to agree with everybody that says stuff, but we have to push back. The majority is not always right. I think it's important that you need to decide at that point. The majority is not always right. And those lonely voices in a room, in a crowded room where there's a lot of noise, have to continue demanding the microphone so that they get to express themselves. And a lot of times reason comes from the lonely voice in that little corner, not from the majority that's shouting. Just like when Mandela said, guys, we can't get rid of the Springbok emblem. And everybody in the room say, no, they have to go. And he was the lonely voice in that room. He said, no, we can't. Let me tell you why we can't do that. And many, throughout the history of humanity, there have always been voices that are overshadowed, that are,
Dissent is one thing, though, Solly Moeng. Unconscionable conduct, behavior that goes against the grain of our values as a society is quite another. Are you saying that there are never instances where, as part of consequence management, we take the power of the consumer and say, we are withdrawing all our support. The only reason you are thriving as a brand, as an individual, even though you engage in this despicable, conduct, is because we continue to support you, and therefore this is where we draw the line and we will withdraw our support. You're saying that's never justifiable?
No, that can be justifiable. But if somebody, for instance, somebody who speaks out, who expresses misogynistic attitude towards women, or who defends the indefensible, especially when it goes against the harmony in society, social harmony, social cohesion. I think that it's justified then to go to shut down those. And it's a good thing that that society is able to describe lines that should not be crossed, provided those lines can be justified. In other words, you don't say to people, you don't speak because you're white, because there was apartheid which was perpetrated by white people for. You can't. That's not acceptable. But when somebody says it's okay to hit a woman because women behave correctly or correctly when you hit their hit, that's a totally different thing. And it's good for society to say, wait a minute, let's push back against this. But it's important to have the conversation to make a distinction between what is defensible and what is not defensible.
Yeah. And then as it plays out in South Africa, how different is cancel culture from how it plays out in countries like the United States, for example, where it is said to be laden with, the views of liberalism and the woke movement, as they understand it there. And it then faces that kind of backlash in the culture wars in that society itself. Do we have the same kind of phenomenon in South Africa?
Yes, but it manifests differently in South Africa. I think that the problem comes when we start putting labels to stuff. I think that we need to agree what are the values that society wants to live by that enhance the unity in diversity, that sort of thing. But then when people start saying you can't speak because you look like this, then it becomes a problem. If they say you can't say stuff, I don't think there should be a moment when we should really shut people up. Apart from only calling for violence and for the enhancement of stepping on human rights, then we should shut them. But there should be explanation even to that. I don't think we should live in a society where we say you can't say certain things because they will find other ways to say those things, sometimes violently. In South Africa, we tend to generally it tends to be racialized because of apartheid. Yeah. I think we should move more away from that. But when it comes to, say, GBV, I'm giving an example, that should be something that we hold dearly, women's rights, children's rights across the society. I think it's a good thing when society steps up, or if it's corruption, for instance, defending somebody who stole money from us, and some of those people are in the National Assembly as lawmakers. I think that's where we want South Africans to say, stop it. We don't even want to hear this particular person because they have all these things hanging over them. But we must have the conversation so that we understand why we're taking certain stances. I don't think that it's right to say you can't speak because you look like this or you are male or you're female. We should never do that.
So how do you advise people whose work has turned them into brands, public brands that people engage with all the time, in the context in which cancel culture is a phenomenon that does exist and tends to mete out the most severe of the consequences, and not in a calibrated manner that says, for this infraction, perhaps we could consider a lesser punishment, but it just basically says, we stop supporting you altogether. How do people whose names have become brands and people who are proprietors of actual brands, how do you advise them to navigate that space?
Yeah, I think all brands, whether they are corporate brands, NGO brands, person brands, must always be aware of the key drivers of sentiment in the communities, in the markets in which they operate. What are the things that would go against the grain? Sometimes brands want to push boundaries, but then you need to have a plan when you push boundaries. For instance, in South Africa, there was a time when you don't depict, say, same-sex marriages, even mixed-race marriages, say on TV in advertisements. And if you're a brand, a corporate brand that wants to say, come on, it's okay to talk about same-sex brands or mixed couple brands, couples, in advertisement. How do you push those brands? You've got to have a plan. I like brands that, like Nando's, that push boundaries, but they have a plan and they can talk about why they're pushing those boundaries. But as a brand, you need to be constantly aware of the things that could drive the market that you're driving towards yourself against you. And if you do that, obviously you're going to be isolated, and no brand is indispensable. People will move to other brands. Yeah. You've got to have a plan around what you're doing. If you deliberately pushing the brand, so the boundaries, you need to say, I'm doing this because this is an important conversation to be had. for instance.
Yeah. All right, Solly, thank you for your time this afternoon. That's Solly Moeng there. He is a reputation management advisor and independent media specialist in his own right. I encourage you to look up that article that I mentioned. It's from the TFG Club magazine, right? So Google that, TFG Club, cancel culture, and there's also a fascinating research paper also coming out of the of Wits University, one of the academics there having written on the subject quite extensively.